The anti-war working group is guided by a commitment to internationalist solidarity and fierce opposition to militarism in all its guises. We believe that militarism plays an essential role in concentrating power and wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and in squashing attempts by Black, Indigenous, and people of color and the working class to reorganize society in a way that allows us all to live and thrive. And we think that the critical ways that militarism cuts across all of our struggles needs to be better understood and illuminated. We also believe that movements for social justice have a better chance at dismantling militarism and winning liberation and self-determination for our peoples when we organize against it jointly and strategically. That is why this working group, welcomed the release of a vision for a feminist peace, a movement-driven foreign policy framework developed under the leadership of Women Cross DMZ, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and Madre as part of their Feminist Peace Initiative. All the current crises that we're currently living through, whether political, economic, ecological, or in the realm of public health, are revealing that the current systems that govern our lives spell death for people who are already most vulnerable. And as grassroots movements on the left are figuring out how to beat back the rise of white nationalism and also put an end to the slow death of capitalism as usual, this framework, a vision for a feminist peace, really couldn't have come at a better time. For one, the document offers organizers useful framing for understanding the pervasiveness of militarism and the entanglements between local and international struggles. It also presents the broader social movements left with a much needed provocation, which is this: regardless of what issue we're working on, grassroots organizers and activists need to take foreign policy seriously as an intimately connected arena of struggle where our movements can drive and win bold policies, but only if we make the connections and we organize ourselves to do it. So I'm grateful to have contributed to writing this document, to serve as a strategic advisor to the Feminist Peace Initiative, and to collaborate with and learn from the group of gender nonconforming and women leaders who developed this framework. Many of them have played key roles in advancing internationalist feminist politics for decades. And lastly, I want to share that our working group chose this framework for study because it is very much a living document that models a way of bridging different struggles under a common anti-militarist frame in a way that's grounded, rigorous, and accessible. It's also for this reason that we decided to host a teach-in around it. We want you to hear from some of the authors and signatories that we have here with us today, to have a chance to hear from your own comments and questions about it, and to come away from this event with some ideas about how you might be able to put some of its principles into action in your own political work. So we're very fortunate to have to be in conversation with some of the authors and contributors to this framework today. You can find a full list of authors on the downloadable PDF of the framework, which you can find at www.feministinitiative.org. And finally, I just want to share that as a takeover of the Capitol last week by members of a growing, emboldened and far right, weigh heavily on our minds and in our hearts as we figure out the path forward. Just invite us to take a deep breath and feel the presence of other feminists and anti-imperialists on this call. Somatize the strength, the strategic brilliance, and the revolutionary love that's already in our movement, and the people that came before us, and the people all over the world fighting U.S. militarism. The other side, the other side of the struggle feels it, and they're afraid to lose their hold on power. So let's feel that power, let's claim it and grow it. That really is the power of a feminist peace. So I'll open today's conversation by directing a specific question to each of our guests with us today, and I'll introduce them along the way. I will later be eliciting some audience questions and comments later in the program. But if you have questions as you hear the speakers, feel free to enter them into the Q&A function of the Zoom. And be sure also to specify who you're directing your question to, a specific panelist or all the panelists. So I'm going to turn to Sunyoung first. Sunyoung Yang is the daughter of a post-Korean War immigrant family, an anti-war feminist, and the mother of a rambunctious toddler who we might be seeing at some point in this session. She is the political director with Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. Prior to GGJ, Sunyoung worked close to a decade at the Labor Community Strategy Center and the Bus Riders Union in Los Angeles as the lead organizer for their transit and climate justice campaigns. She also took a 5-year sabbatical farming in Hawaii, learning about food sovereignty as it relates to the struggle for Hawaiian sovereignty against US military occupation. She's part of the leadership team for the Feminist Peace Initiative. So Sunyoung, welcome. We're glad to have you with us today. And here's the question for you. Just tell us more about a vision for a feminist peace. How did the framework come together? What purpose does it serve? And what are its guiding principles?
So thank you, Yasmin, for the wonderful grounding and the introduction. And I'm very grateful for CP for this invitation and hosting this very timely conversation. I'm also super honored and starstruck by our pretty badass feminist comrades here who are going to be sharing this work with us. I wanted to, introduce the Feminist Peace Initiative, which is a collaborative process that came out of 3 different feminist organizations, as Yasmin has said, GGJ, which is an alliance of 60 grassroots social justice organizations that have been building an internationalist grassroots feminist movement on the intersection of climate, environmental justice, and also advocating for the demilitarization of our society and abolition. And the other group is Madre, a wonderful sister organization that has focused in doing international human rights advocacy, working with women all over the world, you know, from land defenders to fighting for reproductive justice and defending the rights of, you know, bodily autonomy of women and girls, as well as Women Cross DMZ, which is a peace-building feminist organization that's trying to end the longest war, right? The Korean War through a global feminist coalition involvement. So in February 2020, these three organizations brought together an amazing intergeneration of feminists, activists, academics, queer, gender nonconforming, coming from diverse diasporas of backgrounds, you know, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Arab, Asian, and you know, some of the most kind of brilliant minds around feminism and fighting for our liberation, right? And many of these folks have been impacted by US militarism here and abroad. So folks who come with years of experience trying to abolish and transform it. So this initiative was, you know, brought together these powerful, powerful folks to, you know, talk about how we reimagine foreign policy, how do we reimagine reshaping a peace movement in the context, in the conjuncture of where we're at, when we see, you know, the uprising of Black movements creating a tremendous amount of opening for our collective struggles. We see Indigenous folks fighting to, you know, fight against the extraction industry, coming in and taking land and building and passing pipelines through their territory. We see abolition feminists all over trying to free mothers and fight for the dignity of incarcerated folks. So the Feminist Peace Initiative has several goals. One, the primary one, right, is to we want to end the militarized and very coercive approach to foreign policy. And instead, our alternative is pushing for a movement-driven, a movement-centered, a grassroots movement-centered feminist foreign policy, grounded in the historic intersectional internationalist feminist politics that we've all come from. Pushing this different kind of framework means challenging a lot of the patriarchal frameworks and assumptions that are dominant in the United States, especially around security, what makes us safe, and challenging some ideas like, what is domestic when it is foreign, when US intervention and US empire building doesn't have a single place on earth that it hasn't touched, right? We want to center a US foreign policy towards collectivizing our well-being, reversing and repairing the harm done by centuries of US intervention, both inside Black, Brown, Indigenous communities and the borders of what's called the United States, and the harms that were done by wars, sanctions, economic peonage system that's forced on our kindreds in the global South through the IMF and World Bank and other neoliberal policies. So this whole approach is about challenging the status quo of the US foreign policy, US empire building, and talking about how do we start embodying foreign policy as a mechanism for peace and justice, about building collective well-being, reciprocity to people on the planet over profit and capital. So this process will require us to democratize foreign policy with the meaningful inclusion and leadership of those who are on the front lines, who are most impacted by militarism all over. The second this is like third goal, is that we are then, in order to achieve that, we have to really take the task of cross-pollinating and bringing this nectar of anti-militarist, internationalist, feminist lens to every nook and cranny of our movement, the different sectors that is working to transform housing, right? That is trying to end the mass incarceration of our brethren and sisters and kindreds, the movement to fight for justice for migrants and the militarization of borders, you name it, climate justice. We're hoping that this bold plan can be the beginning and an offering of a tool to weave our collective movements, particularly the social justice grassroots movements, to break out of our silos and connect the war at home and war abroad, and be in lockstep with each other. And the key critical piece of this is that policy, as always, must be grounded in grassroots social movements. And right now there is, this whole kind of global pattern of sometimes corporate and neoliberal forces trying to, take up what is feminist foreign policy. It's being used in that purpose. And so we can't cede that ground and must reclaim it and make sure that a feminist foreign policy is shaped by the movement for social justice. So, that's kind of the overall goal and scope of our ambitions of why we put this Feminist Peace Initiative program out. I think in terms of just to go over what are some of the concrete ways that we're trying to accomplish that, right? What are some of the concrete demands that we're putting forth, right? One of, the key thing, without a demand, the system does not concede, right? And we have to organize around it. First thing is we need to reject the status quo of militarization within us, but especially the idea of that militarism, war, and intervention and sanctions are the only way that we do foreign policy. And connecting that with, like I said, the war at home, right? So demands for defund the police, military, ICE, and all its militarism apparatus, divesting from that is critical. And also opposing US military, however it's packaged. We know that when US invaded Afghanistan, they used the excuse that, Afghanistan women were being oppressed and violated, right? Their human rights were being violated. And that's how the neoliberals justified the invasion. And we want to reject that. We don't want the pandering of feminism or any human rights language to continue this activity of war. And critically in that is opposing sanctions. A lot of times sanctions is seen as an alternative to war, that it's like the soft thing to do instead of war, but we know that it's war by another name, by attrition. And the medieval siege tactic that the US has unleashed in many nations has created unimaginable suffering. Right now, as we speak, US sanctions are crippling abilities like countries like Iran and Venezuela and North Korea to be able to access life-saving vaccines. So this is rejecting sanctions is a key component of and demand of this initiative. The second piece is around redefining human security as collective care. In GGJ, we talk about building a regenerative, anti-racist feminist economy that guarantees, basic needs such as housing, healthcare, universal childcare, education, where women and GNC folks have bodily autonomy, reproductive care is valued and centered, and we are in right relationship to the people and the planet. Those are the tenets of genuine security, and globalizing those needs through US foreign policy is what we think is real human security. That includes ensuring asylum seekers are welcome and supported instead of imprisoned or rejected to die. We lead, and the other piece is that we have to lead with a proactive conflict prevention and peace diplomacy. The third kind of component is trying to keep US accountability to international and human rights law, especially as we're navigating the rise of authoritarian right globally, Trump, Modi, Duterte, Bolsonaro, putting out xenophobic agenda and violating and crushing movements. The importance of US being part of these frameworks, conventions of human rights, free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous people, respecting sovereignty. All those pieces are very, very important for us to have a multilateral global peace diplomacy. And then just lastly, the key component also is around reversing and repairing the harm of US exploitation in all the fronts. We see deaths and suffering caused by the United States through drone strikes, as well as through Pentagon's contribution to the climate crisis, right? US military is one of the largest emitter of the climate crisis. And we want to make sure that climate justice is also happening in regards to militarism. So defunding the Pentagon and then redistributing its now $730 billion annual budget is a priority. Imagine if we can take that budget to pay reparations for Black community for the centuries of harm done by chattel slavery to the prison re-enslavement complex. Imagine giving land back to Indigenous folks, paying off our global climate debt, and redressing the damages done by forced migration because of our neoliberal economic interventions, and ending the occupation and militarization of the border of the 800 US military bases around the world. These are the critical components that we think is needed to start reversing and repairing. And moving forward, that foreign policy and our resources are prioritized towards that. So I just want to end with this current moment. We are, yes, we're facing some authoritarian right-wing white supremacy coup. At the same time, the last 4 years has been challenging, but our movement has seen tremendous growth and development, and we are pivoting towards governing power. So I just want to raise, it's an unprecedented moment of movement coalescing, scaling up, experimenting with movement for movements, strategizing around the United Fronts. And there are new formations, mass engagement formations that are forming. I think it's really, really critical that we start to weave and create spaces where we can talk about the Breathe Act, the People's Bailout, and talk about what is our international obligation to make sure that abolition is not something that's within the US, but it's global. So that is, in sum, in my interpretation, the Feminist Peace Initiative.
Thank you so much, Sunyoung, for your wonderful summation and giving folks, who haven't yet had a chance to read the document, even more of a reason to do so. So I'll now turn to Linda Burnham. Besides being a dear, longstanding friend of Center for Political Education, Linda is an author, educator, and political analyst whose thinking and work has been profoundly influential to internationalist feminist politics and the left more broadly. She has served as senior advisor and national research director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She also co-founded the Women of Color Resource Center in Oakland, California in 1989, and was its executive director for 18 years. Linda has been involved with the Venceremos Brigade, the Third World Women's Alliance, the Alliance Against Women's Oppression, the Angela Davis Defense Committee, and so many, many more political projects. She co-authored Home Economics, the Invisible and Unregulated Work of World of Domestic Work. And she has published numerous articles on African-American women, African-American politics, and feminist theory. She is one of the strategic advisors for the Feminist Peace Initiative. And so Linda, as someone with a deep experience in advancing feminist internationalist politics and leading also the fight against US militarism on several fronts, I'd love to hear you talk about the necessity of feminist internationalism during this particular period. And you can define that conjuncture as you wish, and what you think social justice movements have to gain from integrating a feminist anti-militarist analysis into their analysis and also into their practice.
Thanks, Hasmin. Thanks an awful lot. And also thank you to CPE for the incredible work that you continue to do. We really, you and institution CPE to hold down the analytical and intellectual work of building. So all props to CPE, and I just encourage folks to support their work. I was really honored to be invited to the that gathering in February. It was my last trip before the lockdown. So I really appreciate the leading role that Women Across DMZ and GGJ and Madre played in pulling that meeting together. There were incredible set of strategists and thinkers and organizers in the room. And I also want to really encourage everybody who's on this call to sit with the document, which I did again today because I want to remember what was in there. It's a reflection of some, first of all, years of work and thinking and a collaborative writing, which is not always a whole lot of fun, but there's some really deep thinking in there. So I really want to encourage folks to go to the document. I'm sure it's up here somewhere in the chat. Spend some time with it, really read it, study it. In terms of the questions that you're asking me, Hasmin, and I'm going to be relatively brief, maybe. I want to say, first of all, that it's a difficult time to focus people's attention on foreign policy and militarism. So we just need to, first of all, accept that, because we need to understand the situation we're currently in. which is that fabric of democracy is unraveling in all kinds of different directions at home. So not surprisingly, our fellow organizers and activists and social justice folk are really focused on what the last 4 years, just speaking narrowly, what the last 4 years has wrought. And so I think that's part of the frame where we have to understand that and understand that we also are in a situation in which I came up in a time where, and now I'm talking about the 60s into the 70s, where an orientation towards internationalism and an orientation towards US imperialism was understood as a part of more or less every social activist's mindset. And that's not the case as much as it was at one point. Obviously, there are people doing incredible around US foreign policy towards particular countries or regions, doing incredible work around militarism. But I don't think it's the case that an understanding of US foreign policy and an understanding of militarism is as deeply embedded in the social movement as a whole, which is why this Feminist Peace Initiative is so very, very important, incredibly important. So to the question that you raise about why at this conjuncture, I wanna do two things. I wanna say there's a set of arguments that have to do with, we really need to think about militarism because of the military budget and because the fact that these enormous amounts of money, billions and trillions of dollars, are being spent on military bases and military hardware means that that money can't be spent on schools and healthcare and housing and the well-being of the community. And that's a really, really important argument. But there's another argument to be made, I think, which is to understand what's the point of this military in the first place? What's the point of having a military whose budget is larger than the next, I can't even remember anymore, but the next, let's just say 15 nations combined. Somebody on this call will know the exact number. And obviously the point of it is domination and control. Domination and control in the interest of creating climates for transnational corporations to do what transnational corporations do, to corrupt governments so that they function in the interests of the US, to extract raw materials, to exploit workers beyond the borders of the US. So there's a side of this which is understanding the connections between militarism and the kind of softer hand of the US in terms of diplomacy, propaganda around democracy, which we're in a good position. We're not in a very strong position to promote any longer, but yeah, we've been doing that for a long time. And kind of cultural intrusion in all kinds of other countries. So understanding the relationship between militarism and these other forms of power and why and how that was exercised, I think is really fundamental. And one of the privileges of being in the US for people all, of all the different economic and racial and all kinds of demographics, one of the privileges of living in the US is extreme tunnel vision. And so not having to know what's going on in the world, whereas people in other parts of the world absolutely have to know what's going on with US policy. So trying to figure out how to break through tunnel vision on the part of people who don't even know that they have tunnel vision, that's a real task. So it's a task vis-a-vis kind of the mass of people in the US, but it's a task also internal to social movements. That is, how do you know you have tunnel vision if you have tunnel vision? How do you kind of, and it's up to folks who are doing this work to start to really think about, how do we do that? How do we do that? And to sort through what are the educational modalities for us to do that. But I skipped a point that I was trying to make before, and that is, so that it's kind of combination of military and diplomatic and economic policies of domination, to me mean that there's one question that has to do with what do we gain by integrating this into this analysis. But the other side of that question is, what's our responsibility to the madness and chaos that's being perpetrated in our name? What is our responsibility to the people whose lives are being upended in the name of democracy? So I don't know, I'm just gonna put that out there for a minute. And then, let's see, I think one of the other things I wanted to, say about this is that, I said it's difficult to do the education, but it's not impossible. The ways that, I was in my teens when I got drawn into the kind of anti-nuclear ban the bomb movement. When I came into the Third World Women's Alliance, I guess I was in my early 20s. And the Third World Women's Alliance, its kind of slogan was that it was against racism, sexism, and imperialism. And it was an integral part of that organization. You weren't in that organization unless you were learning something about what was going on in other parts of the world. First of all, because of what US foreign policy at the time, first of all, about Vietnam, but also about liberation struggles in other parts of the world and et cetera. So that work was kind of integrated into the life of the organization, along with, bake sales and whatever else we were doing. So I guess I feel like we really have to find the ways that that becomes possible. I also want to talk about one other initiative here. When we were at the Color Resource Center, and Christine Ahn, who's one of the leaders in kind of moving this whole Feminist Peace Initiative forward, was at the Women of Color Resource Center at the time. We came up with a project called Fashion Resistance to Militarism. Let me just say it was a lot of fun. So we started talking about the ways in which military camouflage had become, just something that people wore, and how that was a way in which kind of military orientation culturally embedded the US. And so we did an anti-militarist fashion show. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm just going to say that, one, it was a lot of fun organizing it. And number two, it was an event that hundreds of people came to who had never come to anything else we did. None of our really terrific forums on this, yeah, we saw people we'd never seen because it was a fashion show and it was a lot of fun. So, which is to say that there are many ways in which to do the work, of starting to open people's eyes to what's going on in other parts of the world. Let me see, what else do I have to say here? I don't think I have much else to say. I'm really interested in the discussion and the conversation. I'm really glad that Christine leaned on me and to come into this Feminist Peace Initiative. I'm more or less supposed to be retired and at the same time have a lot of projects, but I do have to say that and I conversation we have after the speakers, that folks will come forward with their ideas about how themselves came to an understanding of militarism, how they themselves came to start to integrate that into their broader political perspective, and what are the ways that we can start to integrate that more deeply into our social movements today. Because, and I'm really glad that the Feminist Peace Initiative has taken this on at this point in time. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much for that, Linda. And on your final point, the questions that we're going to be directing to Janene and Nadine following are precisely about application and about integrating an anti-militarist analysis and practice into their work. So we'll hear from Janene first. Janene Yazzie is the Sustainable Development Coordinator for the International Indian Treaty Council and serves as a co-convener for the UN Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, which engages with the United Nations High-Level Political Forum on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Janene is also the co-founder and CEO of Sixth World Solutions, which works with DNAIC communities to develop projects, programs, and policies that promote sustainability, environmental justice, and self-governance. Janene is also one of the strategic advisors to the Feminist Peace Initiative. Thanks for joining us today, Janene. So I'd love to hear from you. Very briefly, what motivated you to join as an advisor for this initiative? And and secondly, would love to hear you talk more about this. How are you using, or how do you anticipate using the framework in your own organizing work?
Yes. I always get nervous at the prompt to speak slowly, so I start talking weird. First of all, Yate, hello everyone. My name is Janene Yazzie. Sidna Janene Shle. Do Torachitni Bashichin, Natlana Dachiche, Do Zitka Datshanele, Denebekea de Nasha. And it feels really good to say that in this space, coming to you from my homelands. I'm currently living in the occupied city of Gallup, New Mexico, which is ancestral territory of my people and the Zuni people. I'm originally from the Dene Nation. And I wanted to start off in that way because I really want to hold up how I was extremely moved during the beginning of this event and seeing everyone introduce themselves and speak and properly spell from what territories they're coming from. I'm still relatively young. I don't consider myself a youth by any means, but I still have the lived experience of having to explain to people what being Indigenous means, what being Native American means, what being Navajo means, and have only recently been able to fully express myself as being a Dene woman, because Navajo is a term that has been given to our peoples. And so to see those acknowledgements and the correct spellings, really, like, I'm glad my screen was off because I was tearing up over here and just thinking about, like, this is why I got involved in this. This is why I've always felt my soul and my spirit fed by the leadership and the community created by the 3 conveners of this initiative, and why I'm so grateful for intersectional analysis and movement building, because I know my children won't have to grow up with their identity invisibilized and all of these conflicts for how they express who and what they are. Someone even said and recognized Denver as Dinembikeya land, and I think that's what tipped me over the edge. And so I really wanted to hold up what Yasmina said in the introduction about, this is about revolutionary love and the way that we articulate these intersections, and as Sunyoung said, to weave our collective movements together. And coming from a people where weaving is a big part of our tradition and our cultural identity and heritage, like that, it just feels so serendipitous, so blessed, and so powerful to be here and be a part of this initiative in that way. You know, in the fight for Indigenous rights, a lot of times our struggles are themselves siloed in a relationship and response to federal policies, siloed in reservation and tribal government dynamics. And so I've always known, because my educational training is in international politics and human rights, that I needed to be aware of these larger frameworks. Because these domestic systems and structures didn't come from nowhere, right? They have their own roots and their own histories. And so the linking between foreign and domestic policy and the strategies to resist that is vitally important for our collective movements and our collective struggles for freedom and liberation and justice and peace. In the work that I do, which is in the sphere of Indigenous rights, both locally in my community as well as internationally with the global Indigenous rights movement, I've recognized a trend that is undeniable, and that is that women have always been at the forefront of our struggles for peace and liberation. And that now that we are dismantling and undoing all the conditionings of heteronormative patriarchy, we are creating spaces for our femme and non-binary identifying relatives to take their rightful place beside us in that struggle, and to support them in their leadership and the way that they serve a broader linkage for the expansion of our human identities. And so as a result of that, this leadership has also like commonly been at the grassroots and community level. And in those spaces, it becomes very apparent that the reason why we all become called to this action, to this resistance, and to these movements is because we share challenges of confronting heteronormative patriarchy in all its forms, as well, and how that upholds and is supported by white supremacy. In many places, the struggle began with colonization of our lands, and it's those movements that never ended that ended up informing what we have come to know as the movement for sovereignty and sovereign rights. And so I wanted to speak a little to one of the questions we got in the Q&A about whether the movement for sovereignty is relatively new or not, and it's not. I think we create new language, right? We create new language out of necessity to articulate our collective struggles and our lived experiences under these mechanisms of domination and control. And so sovereignty is an aspect of that language, but for Indigenous people, so is feminism. You know, before this, we never really needed to use a term or to create a category of feminism, because our women were considered leaders, were considered decision makers, were considered at every level of leadership and decision making in our communities, and were honored in that way. as were our non-conforming, non-binary relatives. And so now, you know, even the term Two-Spirit has had to be created to restore that heritage that has been disrupted and polluted from the conditioning under these systems of power. And so in our work, and my work in particular, and what I do to fight for sustainability, we have to confront all of the barriers for water security, food security, for environmental justice, and undoing the legacy of environmental violence and the particular impacts that that has had on women and children in our communities. And so to speak to kind of what Linda was asking in terms of how we've come into this consciousness of militarization, for me and my communities, it's the military recruitment, the endemic military recruitment of my peoples into the US military, under the heritage of our Navajo code talkers, who served a very important role in fighting against fascism, but have then had that role used and manipulated to recruit the largest population per capita of military recruitments in our communities. I grew up, my friends grew up in schools where there was 3 military recruiters and no college counselors. And so because of that, you know, as we get older and as we get wiser, we can begin to recognize the effect that that has had on our communities and the broken bodies, broken families, and broken spirits that get returned home with no resources to heal the traumas that they are now riddled with due to their experience. And so the military has a long, complicated legacy in our communities. There's both our heavy allegiance and recruitment into the military industrial complex. And there's also the root of colonization, in which the military played a role in the theft and the exploitations of our lands, territories, and resources, and also the extraction of traditional forms of knowledge and ways of being. And when it comes to being a warrior and to protect your community and protect your peoples, and the way those teachings have now been used to pollute what it means to be a warrior and used as a recruitment tool for the US military now in our homelands. I'm speaking more specifically to how not only are our children bombarded by recruitment opportunities, but our everyday population, if you drive through our reservation, you know, like you'll see more messages and billboards recruiting the warriors of our people for the military than you do seeing messages really talking about the need to protect our water resources and to protect our lands and our peoples. And so the framework that is offered here, and then just like the beautiful thought and heart work that went into articulating this very important document, is critical for helping to educate and teach our people the linkages and show that we're not alone in naming the militarization of our communities, of our lands, as one of the core problems that we face. And so like the linkages are present in all of the different demands that are set forth. You know, the sanctions is very much connected to the same types of economic bondage that we find ourselves in on reservations. It's built from the same formula. And the remedy for that, the collective care, the importance of restoring our relationships and our responsibilities to the earth is a core tenet of what Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women in particular have been fighting for generations. Indigenous peoples' rights are human rights, they're collective rights. And the naming of US invasion, colonization, settler colonialism, and resource exploitation as the pillars of human rights violations and crises around the globe helps us all come together under the proper identification of what is the real enemy. A lot of times we can get lost and confused, especially since all of us are conditioned under these systems, and we can forget how much we're connected and how much our liberation is dependent upon each other. And so that is how I use this tool in our work to guide the way that we engage and build community, political consciousness and capacity, and also how I guide my own path and remembering our collective responsibility to fight for each other's liberation.
Thank you so much for that, Janene, and for being with us here tonight. I will turn now to Nadine Naber, who is also a strategic advisor to the Feminist Peace Initiative. She's a scholar activist, professor at the University of Illinois, and author and co-author of 5 books on Arab American women and women of color feminist activism. Nadine is a founder and co-founder of organizations and institutions such as Mamas Activating Movements for Abolition and Solidarity, Arab and Muslim American Studies at University of Michigan, and the trainings under the name Liberate Your Research. And one of the many cool facts about Nadine is that she is also a former staff person from Center for Political Education. So it's great to have you back here with the family, Nadine. And the question is similar to the one that I posed to Janene, which is what brought you on board as advisor to the initiative, and how do you anticipate, or how are you using the framework in your own work, specifically with the work that you're doing with Mama?
Thank you so much. Okay, I need to get my screen back once I shared. Once you said that, Jasmine, I got all teary. Thank you so much for all your work. I can't even say the word Center for Political Education without tearing up again. I miss my Bay Area family so much. So it's just such an honor to be back, and the circle, you know, of life, how we reconnected, and I met you, Jasmine, and you know, we got to do this work together. It's so powerful. So what I'm going to do is, so I was thinking of 4 parts of the approach that we're talking about, which is how heteropatriarchy and gender violence are essential to US imperialism, colonization, state violence. The second would be the link between the foreign and the domestic. The third is what does a feminist practice bring to how we think about revolution and resistance? And the fourth is about, a lot of us are talking about coalition and all these connections across our struggles. And I just want to affirm that that's very much a feminist politics, to see intersections and multiplicity, and then from there to be able to foster connection across multiple struggles and create movements of many movements like what we're seeing here. So what I'm going to do is just talk about a few different projects that I've been part of. They're not my projects, they're collective projects, but all of them kind of reflect the approach. So one is that, you know, I'll start with back in the day at the Center for Political Education, late 90s, early 2000s, the work around Palestinian liberation in the Bay Area was very much driven by a feminist and to a certain extent, a queer lens that brought out how Israeli settler colonialism targets women's bodies. And I'll be really brief, you know, about all this. Everything I say is going to be a can of worms. How the Israeli settler state recruits queer Palestinians to construct them as collaborators and reinforce their marginality or sense that they're traitors to their people. And then we also worked on how the Israeli settler state shares technologies with US policing and prisons, and how both of those rely on sexualized violence. And there are also connections with the American Indian movement back at that time. And now I'm just gonna pause for a minute and let that sink in and jump to Egypt. I had the opportunity to be connected to the Egyptian revolution that sparked in 2011. And I'm going to just show some slides. And I want to bring up Egypt because the US backs Egyptian authoritarian dictators and neo-fascism and authoritarianism to further economic neoliberalism, which is what we've been talking about in big words, but I want to give some specific examples from the region of North Africa. And so you have the US-backed militarized policing in Egypt that the purpose of it is to crush resistance and further authoritarianism and global economic neoliberalism. And from there, you also have, as an extension, CIA secret prisons. And all of these rely on sexualized violence, whether it's targeting women activists through shaming, through framing women activists as quote unquote prostitutes, or using virginity testing. And all along, the authoritarian regime relies on the idea of the heteronormative family to quell the revolution. So there's this idea that like the real place of women is in the home. And so if a woman is in the street, she deserves to be punished. And so when I was working with a coalition of 13 feminist organizations in Egypt, we found that many of the women who were in the, who were essential to the revolution were mothering, whether it was their own children or non-biological children. They were mothering while protesting. And this raises really interesting issues about how, when you bring a feminist lens to think about resistance, and what we heard from Sunyoung in the beginning about what does feminism bring to how we think about, when we think about the agents of change. So when we think about, so what I wanted to bring up is this lens of mothering, which is part of my work now, that when we think of mothering and care work, what does that bring to how we think about resistance? And so when we are talking about Egypt, when, we found, one of the things that we saw in this coalition is that when you're looking at, women's work in the protests, in the sit-ins at Tahrir Square, that women refuse to allow their revolutionary labor to be sidelined by mothering or their family-based responsibilities. And in fact, it was not just that mothering limited their resistance, but it expanded the possibilities of resistance. So what I mean by that is it's not just that women happened to be mothers while they were, enacting revolution, but they were expanding how we think about revolution, because if you think about the sit-in in Tahrir Square, just like Standing Rock, it reached a point where everyone in the square was mothering in order for the sit-in to survive. So everyone was feeding each other, caring for each other, uplifting young people. And women who had to stay home because they had babies or young kids and couldn't go to Tahrir Square. They were some of the people who were providing internet access to the protesters in Tahrir Square when the regime shut down the square and shut down the internet. So these are just some examples of what we don't see when we use a hetero masculinist lens and think about who are the agents of resistance, what are the strategies of resistance, and where does resistance take place? So I wanted to uplift all of that. And the other thing along those lines is that if we think of like a hetero patriarchal lens, this is what we saw with how mother activists were framed. We saw the left in general sensationalizing mothers of martyrs as like objects or symbols of the revolution, but not as agents of the revolution. We saw the authoritarian regime, as I said earlier, mother shame. So basically blame women protesters for not doing their motherly work at home, and therefore punishing them when they stepped out of the boundaries of like conventional concepts of mothering. And then we also saw the corporate media in general in Egypt and across the world sensationalized images of women pushing strollers and showing up at Tahrir Square as if to say everyone in Egypt was part of the revolution, even mothers, you know, even the most unpolitical, even the most, you know, the last people you would ever imagine, even mothers were there. So what I want to bring up is this idea of challenging that sentimentalized idea of care work. So it kind of leads into this discussion that people are talking about now around care work and mothering labor, that mothering labor and care work are either sentimentalized, or they are seen as, you know, like liberal philanthropy, like I'm going to do care work to do charity or something. But what I'm suggesting, based on the feminist approach, you know, when we look at feminist models of resistance, that we think about how care work, collective care work, mothering labor, providing what people need to eat to survive is essential to resistance and revolution and the kinds of changes that Linda and others talked about, and Jasmine, that we're trying to, you know, strive for. I did bring some images and I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to talk too much. So I'll show you the images because I think it helps. You know, even mothers were there, the mothers of the martyrs images that circulated all over the world. But the reality was, this is what mothers were doing in Tahrir Square, leading chants, you know, standing up to the police, to the army. These are, some of them are labor organizers. And so that leads me to my project in Chicago, I'll be really brief on, which is about, or, you know, you could tell me about the time. I'm now working with a project called Mamas Activating Movements for Abolition and Solidarity. So that work in Egypt led to this project, which is basically a collective that I think represents the feminist approach. It's an attempt to do what the Women of Color Resource Center did before, that Linda referred to, the Third World Women's Alliance, movements like Insight, which is a movement of many movements. So what we do here is we uplift people who do the labor of mothering within struggles against state violence, the undocumented struggle in Chicago, the Palestinian liberation struggle, the struggle against policing, and the Indigenous struggle. And we do it all through the framing of mothering. And so I'll say just a couple of points to continue that point from before, that one of the, let's see here. One of the things that we do, I'll just talk about this woman, Bertha Escamilla. Her son was tortured by Chicago police, and she has been at the front lines of this struggle against police violence in Chicago for police torture survivors. And, you know, she's part of this collective that, you know, these mothers of police torture survivors are often pitied, or they're ignored, or they're blamed, you know, for quote unquote, the criminality of their children. But the reality is that these mother activists are on the front lines of the movement for abolition and police violence in Chicago. But the point that I want to make is they're not just there with everybody else, they're bringing something really unique and specific, which is the framing of collective care work. So if we just talk about Bertha, for example, she, my comrade Bertha, she has been collecting data on the cops, the detectives, the judges, and bringing to the movement more and more people who have claims of police torture. So she has created this, we were able to put together this Excel sheet based on her data that I'm not going to leave up here because it has a lot of information in it that is too specific for my point, which is that what people do with the data that she collects is these mothers share this data with each other and everyone who's targeted by police violence. Mothers, loved ones, lawyers, researchers, activists, all rely on the data she shares. And my point here with this is that this is collective information sharing and relationship building. It's an example of collective care work that for mother survivors of police violence is a way of life. It's born out of the realities of mothering while being targeted by state violence. And another mother, Armanda, who's on the right of this slide, you know, even if her son gets out, she says, when Gerald gets out, people say my fight is over, but no, the fight is just beginning. This is what I'm fighting for. Gerald is not there by himself. And so all along, this mothering lens allows us to see, you know, alternative approaches to resistance that are collective and take on collective responsibility for each other's children, care work, and demanding justice all at once. So it's not that they do the care work and the real activists do the resistance. No, they're doing both, and it's all intertwined. So that's kind of one thing I wanted to uplift. And then finally, I'll just close by saying that in all of this work, I think one thing that, you know, about this approach that we're talking about is it's very much about centering, to me, it's about centering a critique of the US nation state as founded on genocide and as an ongoing state of war, you know. And so when we center Indigenous, US-based Indigenous struggle in our work against militarism and against policing, it kind of gives us this approach, I guess you could say, that requires us to be internationalists, because it's, you know, the US nation state and US settler colonialism is itself not bound to US borders. And so I think that's very important. And then finally, I'll say, did I say finally like 10 times? Sorry about that if I did. Okay, can you just nod, Jasmine? Should I end right this minute? I'm good with it.
30 seconds.
I'm good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll end. I'll end by bringing it back to, well, I think I'll just ask this question. I think where I am, and we, like all the people I'm working with, folks who used to be part of Insight, like Clarissa Rojas, I'm thinking with on these things. And what we're trying to talk about in applying this feminist approach that we've been saying here is that if the abolitionist struggle asks, what kind of social conditions do we need to make prisons unfathomable, we can expand the question to what social conditions and practices can we enact to make war, colonial occupation, empire, and militarism no longer relevant and even unimaginable. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of that, and for that question, definitely for our movements to answer together in our practice. Just inviting us all to take a deep breath after having absorbed so much information from all of our panelists. And then I'll share a question to all of the panelists here. And thinking about the state of the anti-war movement right now, that has been pretty consistent for a long time. But I'd love to hear from the panelists, what is your assessment of what can be done to revitalize anti-war organizing in this moment? What are the sectors that would or the sectors of the movement that would benefit the most from joining? And what kind of analysis do we need to formulate, especially if we're trying to activate more people? So if you have some ideas about, making an assessment of what it means to revitalize the anti-war movement today, what voices, what pieces of analysis are missing, who needs to be on board, and how do we bring them in as well? I'd love to direct that to the panelists. And feel free to chime in, and any of y'all who are ready to. Linda, would you like to start us off with a few remarks, since you've been part of this movement for a long time?
Yeah, we all got quiet. I was trying to kind of scroll through there and take a look at the questions in the chat. Well, you know, I mean, I feel like this Feminist Peace Initiative is a start, and it's also true that we have to, I think we have to find better means to engage people because, or multiple means to engage people because, you know, that document is whatever, 20 pages long. I don't know, and a lot of activists who are gonna, I mean, a lot of activists actually don't have so much on their plates on the day-to-day, moving stuff on the ground, that the idea of sitting down and, you know, reading this 20-page document and then trying to figure out who they're gonna deconstruct it with, it's just not gonna happen. So, you know, I feel like we have to find ways to engage with the organizations that are doing fabulous work in motivating and moving people out around a whole range of issues to make a really compelling case for why everybody who's got some notion about racial inequity, economic equity, climate change, you know, why the kind of ideas that are generating in people's heads about that kind of stuff are not integrated with a fuller sense of the US role in the world. And I think I think we do have openings. The fact that the Black Lives Matter movement of the spring went international as quickly as it did. You know, there are ways that we're interconnected and in conversation with each other that we haven't ever been before. But I feel like we're learning. We're still learning how to do the educational work and the narrative work and the messaging work that is compelling to people on the question of, if you don't understand how the US is functioning in the world, you don't understand your world. And just as people have, I mean, what gives me hope is I feel like that in part what this past spring showed that it takes a lot to wake people up. You know, people have to die evidently in the streets. It takes a lot to wake people up, but then masses of people do wake up and come to a different understanding of, for example, how race works in the US. And you think, okay, centuries along, so that's frustrating, but just because it's frustrating doesn't mean we don't need to still find ways to kind of insert the issues and the narratives and the education. And I think in some ways, also with the unraveling of democracy, in some ways there are openings in terms of how are people seeing the world? What people are really, people's brains are scrambled at the moment. And in times when people's brains are scrambled, it's helpful to come with some coherent thinking and concepts about what's going on in the world. So I don't know, that's what I'll say for the moment.
Thank you. Would any of you three, Janene, Nadine, Sunyoung, like to take a stab at this question about what needs to be done to revitalize the anti-war movement? Who do we need to bring in for that? Okay, there's another question that's being posed to all the panelists. So since we are coming to a close, we're gonna give everybody a chance to answer this question in one, visionary sentence. And the question is, for all the panelists, how would you redirect the stolen resources of the bloated US military to achieve your desired futures? So let's think big about this. And I'll start with Sunyoung.
Sorry, I was staying quiet because my baby is finally asleep. But yes, well, that's $730 billion. That's a lot of that's a lot of funding. I think that I would like to redirect it to, uplifting all the kind of the visionary demands that have been coming out recently, from, implementing a Green New Deal to Breathe Act, to ensuring universal childcare and healthcare and housing for all, as well as being able to ensure that, feminists and our sisters around the world, can have access to the tech and the money that they need to adapt to climate. So that's where I would redirect the money.
Thank you, Sunyoung. And tell us, Janene, what's your vision for how these all of these stolen resources would be redirected?
Oh my God, like, why haven't I asked myself this question before? I'm a mess. I'm a mess after hearing all your brilliance and feeling all the love and all of the possibility of movement building. And one of the things I did want to offer, Linda, is that maybe this democracy needs to be unraveled because it wasn't structured right in the first place off of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the example that they set for what true equitable democracy is supposed to look like. And this could be an opportunity to start again. So in that light and in that faith, I imagine the redistribution of resources to go to radical care work, to go to the movements on the ground and be redistributed among all of the groups that have a radical imagination for peace and liberation, but more particularly to the Indigenous peoples who are still trying to hold it out and reclaim their relationship on their stolen lands and territories, the lands that miss them, that miss their people. We operate often from looking at these linkages between state and militarized violence of our lands, the criminalization of human rights and land rights defenders, the loss of habitat and ecosystems, and all of the work that needs to be done. And at the end of the day, when you listen to the prayers and when you listen to the hopes and visions of our Indigenous matriarchs and the plans that they have for our collective future generations, it's a prayer for healing and regeneration. And I think that that's where those resources need to go to make up for the rape of our Mother Earth and the exploitation of Black and Brown bodies across the globe.
Thank you for that, Janene. I'll hand it over to Nadine. Okay. Oh, I'm handing it over to you, Nadine.
Got it. No, I got some weird thing on the Zoom come up. Yeah, so such a big, huge question. I would say free Palestine from the river to the sea, free them all, free all incarcerated people, and for Indigenous peoples all over to determine, what the structures and visions for their land. And really, when you said the question, I was thinking of that moment after the Egyptian revolution when there was a moment of victory for 17 million people, and how there was a need for time to build the new Egypt, and that Egyptians were denied that possibility. And so I think that's just something I would add, is for people to have the space to build nurturing relationships with each other and decide what they want their society to be.
Thank you, Nadine. And I'll give you, Linda, the last word for this question.
I'm gonna answer a question with a question. And that is, how do we build a movement of scale that it's capable of transforming the politics of the nation, the country, so that redirecting the military resources is actually a real possibility instead of a pipe dream?
Thank you for that, Linda. And which moves me into this, final closing part of this conversation. The Feminist Peace Initiative is definitely evolving. This is part of more continued conversations. And this question that Linda posed is one that we need to confront directly head on through experimentation and through analysis and principled struggle. And so we want to make sure that people come away with some ideas about how to carry, some of this work of the Feminist Peace Initiative forward. So I'm going to turn to each panelist, very briefly name one concrete thing that people could plug into that's coming up, or an ask that you have related to an organizing project that's aligned with the Feminist Peace Initiative. So I'm going to turn over to Sunyoung.
Yeah, can I have two?
Sure.
So first and foremost is to endorse and join the Feminist Peace Initiative by signing on your name, your institution, and as it's still a baby, and we're still trying to nurture it and grow it, but we need the collective to be able to do that. So please, there's an endorsement link that was just dropped, and we will definitely reach out to you all to connect and loop you in on some of the next steps of the Feminist Peace Initiative. And then the second piece is that actually this Saturday, the Frontline, which is, speaking of, intersectional, Black-led, multiracial feminist leadership, the Frontline is hosting a mass organizing call to both hold Trump and the right-wing fascists accountable, but also further than that, all the dreams and demands that we were visioning as a movement together, talking about kind of the next steps of how we bring it to reality, how do we coalesce our movement further and further, and actually really talk about, put in practice what Linda's asking, is that how do we grow into scale and actually pivot and grow our power so that it's, this idea of defunding the Pentagon is not just a pipe dream. So please join the Frontline this Saturday on the mass organizing call. And it's a concrete space for folks to, connect and be part of this mass scale experiment. So
thank you, Sunyoung. Linda.
I don't have any particular ask other than that all of those remaining on the call really give some thought to how some of the principles expressed in that document get incorporated into the organizations that you're currently working in.
Thank you for that. Janene?
Just building off of what Sunyoung said, join us on the front lines and support and uphold Indigenous people's rights.
Thank you. Nadine?
I would suggest for folks, when you think of applying the framework, to commit to solidarity if you're not from the Arab region or North Africa, with all the people, and not just one place like Palestine, but seeing it in connection to the whole region, from Iran to Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and all the terrifying, horrific struggles people are facing on the ground in the entire region.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Linda, Nadine, Janene, Sunyoung for joining us tonight. I also want to end with lifting up the call to endorse the framework. It's definitely still a living initiative. And so we need all organizational hands on deck to keep thinking about this and thinking about how to apply it, to your work very concretely.